There are many definitions of poetry, as there are poets. William Wordsworth defined poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Emily Dickinson said, "If I read a book and it makes my body so cold no fire can warm me, I know that's his poetry." And Dylan Thomas defined poetry this way: "Poetry is what makes me laugh or cry or yawn, what makes my toenails twinkle, what makes me want to do this or that or nothing." Poetry is, of course, a lot of things to a lot of people, and to give us her definition of poetry, we have Teopolina Matheus, who's also known as Anilo Poet. Good evening and welcome.
Thank you very much, Nina, for having me. Good evening.
Thank you so much for being here. That was quite a mouthful of an intro, but I think it does justice to the definition of what poetry is, which is so broad and so wide, and everybody interprets it differently, as they should. What is your definition of poetry, Teopolina?
Well, my definition of poetry is basically anything that moves. It's culture, it's entertainment, it's word, even the way a person moves and speaks. To me, that is poetry. It's respect. Poetry has so many definitions. I guess it just depends on the individual, how they define poetry and in what spectrum they are defining poetry in.
Yeah.
Yes.
When did you tap into the art of poetry, I would say?
The art of poetry specifically, I believe I tapped in when I was 15 going to 16, if I remember correctly. That is when I started reading books on poetry, researching poets.
What sparked that interest?
I don't know. I read, okay, not I don't know. I read a book by Shakespeare, William Shakespeare once, and I'm just like, okay, the English used here, the wordplay, the amount of words put into to describe something so little or something so big or something that might be meaningless, that is when I was like, okay, this must be what poetry is. And that is because I have been a writer most of my life. I remember writing, I think, since I was 11 or 10, I have been writing, and when I grew older to 16, 15, that is when I found my love and interest for poetry.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Obviously, William Shakespeare is one of the classics, and when you speak poetry, you can't speak poetry without mentioning him. But who are some of your, other favorite poets?
It's amazing how you took that right out of my mouth. I was going to say you can't speak poetry without mentioning William Shakespeare. You can't speak poetry without mentioning Rita Dove. There's a really good line of hers, I think, in one of her pieces, where she goes like, "The world is calling and I answered," because you just have to answer, you can't just sit down. And I'm just like, okay, these are some of the classic poets in the world. When you look up the most famous 10 poets in the world, these names are in the top 5. And now we have button poetry in America. We have the likes of Sarah Kay, we have the likes of Phil Kay, and these are poets that are on a daily basis influencing the way I write and the way I see the world, which is so differently but not so different, if you know what I mean.
Where do you draw your inspiration from, for your own poems that you write? What are your poems mostly focused on?
My poems are mostly focused on experience, not necessarily personal. It's experience that I have picked up from different people, experience that I have heard, experience that I have walked into, that I have seen. It's art, it's stories. My poetry is storytelling, because each and every single person, each and every single individual goes through something, and they write it down either as a note or as a memoir for them to remember, or maybe they even start their first page to their book, So for me, that is poetry. That is where I draw my inspiration from, experiences, art, and all various compartments in my life, like school, family, friends, and now this that I'm doing, which is frankly speaking, and that is where I draw my inspiration from.
I don't know if my next question will make sense poetically speaking, but I don't know if there are genres to poets, because you do find poets who focus on, you know, romantic and romanticism and love, and then you find the philosophical poets who speak deeply about life and you know, their views and thoughts and experiences. And then, if you had to box yourself, which genre of poet would you say you are?
That is a hard one. That is a hard one. I can't really box myself in any of those, because I can write not almost on anything. Like I've mentioned earlier, it's mostly experiences, it's stories, it's art, it's what I hear and see on a daily basis. And this is what influences my writing. So if I have to box my poetry in one of the genres, maybe it will be inspirational, or it will be, I don't know, the word is not coming to me, you know, it's just emotion. I'm a very emotional writer, and unlike other poets that focus on philosophy, that focus on culture, that focus on love, I'm more of an emotional writer.
Give us a taste of what an emotional poet sounds like. You've prepared a little something. We'd love to hear it.
All right. What an emotional poet sounds like. I hope not to make anybody cry. I'm joking. It's not sad. It's not sad at all. This one, if I can just speak a little bit on it, I believe I wrote this one in 2017 or 2017. Yes, it's very short. All of us live with a demon inside. Some days we control the demon, and other days it controls us. It's always hungry. It feeds on lust, on longing, and while you may slumber, the demon never sleeps.
No problem.
And while you may slumber, the demon never sleeps. It tempts you into crossing every line you have ever drawn, or while it haunts you, renders you incapable of telling friend from foe. But once it has turned your loved ones into your enemies, the demon would have consumed you whole. Kill a demon today, face the devil tomorrow. Yet, even as you dug on that demon's grave, you can't help but wonder, was the demon alone, or do you have any other deadlier ones to fight? I know you celebrate having won the battle, but are you really prepared for the war? So as you dress yourself in the armor needed for this new fight, you must first attend to your wounds, starting with the deepest.
Teopolina, what was going on in 2017 when you wrote that poem? What was happening?
This one I wrote after a friend came to me emotional about how they don't know how they're gonna continue living their life, where to start, where to go from where they were at that specific juncture at the time. And this was basically taken out from a letter that I wrote to her. So it was an experience in that specific juncture in my life, and I was just like, you know what, let me make the letter a little bit fancy and turn it into a little piece of poetry.
Teopolina, do you think poetry is still relevant, revered, relished, you know, as it perhaps was in the past?
Sure. I believe poetry has never not been relevant, right? Poetry is everything that we do on a daily basis. It starts from the very small things that we do. For example, greeting your loved ones in the morning. Good morning, hi, how are you? How did you sleep? That is poetry, because it is art, it is respect. There's a thought process put into that, the way you speak to people. But if we have to technically speak, poetry is still relevant in this spectrum of life. It has never died out. Maybe people don't see the importance and the need of poetry, but it has never not been relevant. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that you're part of Frankly Speaking.
Yes.
Talk to us about this group.
Frankly Speaking is poetry house. Right. Frankly Speaking is a poetry house that was founded in August 2020 by Frida Mokufa, and Franklin Shitaleni. And over the years, they have taken on to associate poets, namely 44 Times, Officially Poetic, Mr. Poet, Anila Poet, who is me. So right now, it is actually a poetry house made up of 6 poets, with 4 associate poets and 2 founders. And we are basically a house that is trying to educate fellow poets on poetry, on what poetry is, that poetry is relevant, poetry is necessary, and poetry does not need to die. So that is basically what Frankly Speaking is about.
Awesome.
At this specific juncture.
You have an event coming up soon? Talk to us about that.
Yes, we have an event coming up that will be on the 25th. 24th. It will be on a Saturday. It will be on a Saturday at Muzo's Cafe. Muzo's Cafe is in Ospenplatz, Marinsky Street, I think the small mini circle next to DHPS, right? So that is where we host our Frankly Speaking's event. It's a once a month event, and each and every single month we host it at Muzo's Cafe. We have attendance basically of over 60 people, over 100 people per night. So yeah.
And Anila the poet will be performing?
Anila Poet will be performing. Anila Poet performs at each and every single Frankly Speakings. However, there is also slots, open mic slots, open to 1 to 2, 3. 1 to 3 actually, 1 to 3 open mics, and that is because we are now starting this new format where we want Frankly Speaking to focus on Frankly Speaking poets. And the open mics, these are people that have auditioned and they have qualified to actually perform on that specific Frankly Speaking's night. So let's say this coming Friday at Muzo's Cafe, there will be 3 open mics, and it will be dedicated to those 3 open mics, that have previously auditioned to perform. And then after those 25 to 30 minutes, we dive into the Frankly Speaking's team, and then the focus continues from there. And moving forward, that will be the format.
Interesting.
Yes.
All right. Just lastly, I want to ask, for a young person that feels they've got this gift of being a wordsmith and the gift of the gab and would like to get into poetry and has been writing for a while, but doesn't know where to begin and where to, give them some advice this evening.
I believe the advice is start writing, right? If you're already writing, continue from there. However, if you want it to be poetry, make sure that it is poetry. Is it art? Is it culture? Is it respect? Are you putting effort and time into it? Because there's a difference between you just picking up a pen and writing a letter to your loved one, or picking up your phone, which we are now glued to these days, picking up your phone and typing a text message to your boyfriend or your sister because you're angry at her. That is merely writing, but poetry is craft, and that craft needs to be respected. That craft needs to
be perfected.
To be perfected, yes. It is perfection, it is practice that makes perfection, right? So if you're writing, you need to put your effort into it, you need to put your time into it, you need to put your heart into it, you need to do research, you need to attend events, you need to read. So if there is somebody that is currently writing and they want to focus their writing more into poetry, these are the certain aspects that they have to look into to perfect this craft of poetry.
Awesome advice. Teopolina, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope our viewers also learned a thing or two. One poet who you didn't mention on your list of stellar poets is the great Maya Angelou.
Yes. I'm sorry, Maya Angelou.
No problem. We didn't forget her though. On that note, we're coming to the end of tonight's program, and we're going to leave you by the ever popular poem by Maya Angelou, Still I Rise. We're back tomorrow. Join us then. From myself and the crew, good night and enjoy.
You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust,